We all have that family member that we say, oh, that's just Uncle Joe, or that's just how cousin Jerry is, right? If you think your family tree is messed up, wait until you see the family tree of Jesus. Yikes. Let's check it out. Welcome to Equipped. I'm your host, Mario Escobedo. This channel is all about learning how to study the Bible correctly and also learning how to share it effectively. If you're new here, thanks for joining me. Consider subscribing so that you're always up to date with the new teachings that I'm putting out. All right, so in the New Testament, there are two of the Gospels that include a genealogy of Jesus. We have Matthew and Luke, and they're very different. And there are reasons for that. I'm not going to go into that in this teaching. But what I want to look at is the genealogy of Jesus as presented in the book of Matthew. Now, there are a ton of names there, but I only want to focus on four specific names. The four names of women, the four women who appear in the genealogy of Jesus. Now, for the first name, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 1, and we're going to look at verse 3. This is the very first woman who appears in the genealogy of Jesus. It says right here, Judah, the father of Perez, and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So right there, Tamar, that is the first woman who appears in the genealogy of Jesus. Now, to understand who Tamar is, we have to go into the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 38. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail there, but if we scroll down to verse 15, here's what we find out, that Terah, she's had two husbands, they've both died. And now she finds out that her father-in-law is more than likely not going to give her another one of his sons so that she can have children. So what does she do? She dresses up like a prostitute and she deceives her father-in-law into thinking that she's a prostitute, and they actually sleep together. Look, this is what we read in verse 13. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with the veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. Then later on, we scroll down, verse 15. When Judah saw her, this is her father-in-law, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. And then we look in verse 16, where Judah tells her, come now, let me sleep with you. And of course, we do find out that, yes, they did sleep together. Now, that's kind of messed up, right? This is her father-in-law. But the reason she was doing it, you could say, I don't know if she was right, she was wrong in doing it. I don't know, you decide that. The act itself was obviously wrong. She's committing adultery, fornication, and she's doing it with her father-in-law. So that's just wrong all the way around. What I'm interested in pointing out is that this woman appears in the genealogy of Jesus. A woman who dressed up like a prostitute, slept with her father-in-law, ends up appearing in the genealogy of the Savior of the world. But wait, it gets better, because there are more women who appear in the genealogy of Jesus. Let's go back to the book of Matthew. And for this, we're going to look back at Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Now, this name you're probably more familiar with. This is Rahab. So you'll notice that in chapter 1, verse 5, it says Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Now, again, I'm pretty sure you know the story of Rahab. This goes back to the book of Joshua. And Rahab was the prostitute. Now, she was a prostitute. In fact, let's look at Joshua chapter 2, I believe it is. Yeah, Joshua chapter 2, where we find out that Rahab is a prostitute. Joshua sends some spies to the city of Jericho to spy out the land. And this is what we read in verse 1. Joshua of Nun secretly sent out two spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went in and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they stayed there. Okay, so we have another woman, the second woman in the genealogy of Jesus, and she is a prostitute. Now, Tamar just acted like a prostitute or dressed up like a prostitute, but Rahab was definitely a prostitute. So this is woman number 2 in the genealogy of Jesus. And already with both of these two women, there's some questionable behavior, right? Things that we would not be in agreement with these two women who appear, these first two women who appear in the genealogy of Jesus. Let's see what goes on with the third woman in the genealogy of Jesus. And for this, we'll look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, still in verse 5. After talking about Rahab, then we talk about Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. So this is Ruth, the third woman in the genealogy of Jesus, and this is David, King David's grandmother. Now, probably, I'm going to guess that most of the stories you've heard about Ruth have been about the nobility of Ruth, what an upstanding woman she was, how she told her mother-in-law Naomi that wherever she went, she would go. Her God would be her God. Her people would be my people. All that stuff. Wherever she dies, I'm going to die too. And that's great. It is a great story. But there are some questionable components to the story of Ruth. And so let's take a look at the story of Ruth. And for that, we're going to go to the book of Ruth. Ruth. And I'm going to jump all the way down to chapter 3. Okay, because here's what we find out about Ruth in verses 1 through 4. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you've worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor." Now here's where things get kind of questionable. "But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He'll tell you what to do." And we find out that in the later verses, Ruth does that. She goes and she uncovers his feet. Now, scholars have talked about that phrase, uncovering his feet, because there are some places in the Old Testament where feet can be used as a euphemism for genitalia. Now, the word euphemism means a nice way of saying something that you don't really want to say. All right. So in the case of this euphemism, instead of using the word genitalia, you would use the word feet. Now, no one's 100% sure on this, but there are some scholars, Old Testament scholars, who suggest that what's really being said, what Naomi really tells Ruth, is go and uncover his genitalia, whatever that means. And we find out that Ruth indeed goes and she uncovers his genitalia, or rather his feet. I'm sorry. She uncovers his feet. Okay. It could mean something sexual. We don't know for 100% certainty. We don't know. We don't. But there's a possibility that it could mean that there could have been some sexual misconduct that would have taken place between Ruth and Boaz. However, let's give Ruth the benefit of the doubt. And let's say that nothing bad happened. Nothing at all. Although she does sneak into the tent of Boaz and she does sneak out before anyone notices her. Make of that what you will, right? But let's say that absolutely nothing happened between Ruth and Boaz. There still is the question of Ruth's ancestry. We find out in chapter 1 of Ruth that Ruth is a Moabite. She is a Moabite woman. Now, who are the Moabites? Well, just get ready for this, okay? You might already know this, but I'll just get ready for this. For this, we're going to go back to the book of Genesis. Yeah, we're going to go into Genesis to find out about the Moabites, and we're going to go to chapter 19, verse 36. Now, this is the story of when Lot and his family has escaped Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? And here's what we know so far, that he and his daughters escaped. His wife escaped with them, but she turned back to look at Sodom and Gomorrah as it was burning up, and she turns into a pillar of salt. Lot and his two daughters go and they're hiding out in the mountains, okay? What do his daughters do? They get Lot drunk, and then one night, one of them goes in and sleeps with him, has sex with her dad. Another night, the other daughter goes in and does the same thing, has sex with her dad. Look at what it says in Genesis. So, chapter 19, verse 36. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The yuck factor, the ick factor, it just went way up, right? Anyway, that's what it says. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. Okay, now remember, we said that in Ruth chapter 1, we find out that Ruth is a Moabite woman. So again, let's give Ruth the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that absolutely nothing happened between her and Boaz. Well, her ancestry is still very questionable, right? Her ancestry, in fact, the Moabites were not allowed in the assembly. They weren't allowed to participate with the Jewish feasts and the Israelite feasts and all that stuff. They were banned from that, probably because of that, of the incest that took place. 3 women in the genealogy of Jesus, and all 3 of them have, to say the least, questionable events surrounding their lives. You've got the first one, Tamar, who slept with her father-in-law. The second one, Rahab, who is a prostitute. The third one who appears is Ruth. whose ancestry is very questionable, and she may have had some questionable actions as well. And let's look at the fourth woman in the genealogy of Jesus. This story, of course, is very well known. For this, we're going to go to 2 Samuel 11. And this is where David has an affair with Bathsheba. One evening, verse 2, one evening David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." We go back to Matthew chapter 1, and she appears in verse 6. And of course, she appears as the mother had been Uriah's wife, the mother of Solomon. So there is yet the fourth woman. The fourth woman has, again, a questionable background. And they all have a questionable background. But the questionable background in all four of these has to do with something that is sexual. Okay, every single one of them. Acting like a prostitute, Tamar, and having sex with her father-in-law. Rahab, a prostitute, obviously, sexual. Ruth, there's perhaps some stuff around her sexually, but if not, her ancestry, there's incest, horrible. And then Uriah's wife, or Bathsheba, there's adultery. So in each one of these four women, there is the sense of sexually illicit events taking place in their lives. And still all four of them appear in the genealogy of Jesus. And I look at that and I say, Matthew, okay, so you included women. That's great. But aren't there other women, or weren't there other women in the genealogy of Jesus that you could have included that didn't have these questionable events surrounding their lives? What about Sarah? What about Rebecca? What about Rachel? What about these women that, from what we can tell from Scripture, are pretty upstanding and chaste and all that stuff? Why not include those women instead of these four women? I mean, you could have included anybody, and you choose to include these four women who have very clearly have some sexual stuff surrounding their stories. Now, I've heard some teachings that try to explain why these four women were included. And the truth be told, we don't know 100%, we're not 100% sure as to why these four particular women were chosen for the genealogy. But I've seen some people try to kind of sanitize their stories and say, for example, I heard a teaching that Tamar, the fact that she engaged in sexual relations with her father-in-law, it was just that she was so concerned with serving her neighbor, like helping her neighbor. And so she didn't want her father-in-law's house to be shamed, so she had sex with her father-in-law. I don't see that. I don't see that. So there's some people who try to sanitize these stories and make these women appear more virtuous than the Old Testament stories actually make them out to be. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where people try to associate a particular type of sin to each of these women. So that one woman represents the grace of God. Another woman represents a fallen sinner who comes back to God. And so each of these four women represent a different kind of sin that Jesus came to redeem. I think that's probably pushing it too far. I do think that these four women are included in this genealogy because they are meant to demonstrate that despite this messed up genealogy, it's still the perfect God-man who comes out of that genealogy to rescue all of humanity from sin. And these women are representative, as are all the people in this genealogy, because they're sinful humans. These women are representative of the sinful nature of humanity in general. And that Jesus, despite coming out of that type of a genealogy, that kind of an ancestry, he is still fully God. He is perfect, and despite all that, he is still sufficient. His work is sufficient to redeem humanity from all sin, even though he comes from that type of a background. Not only that, but there are Gentile women in this genealogy, for sure. Rahab and Ruth, Gentile women in the genealogy of the Jewish Messiah. And I think Matthew intentionally, of course, he does this intentionally to demonstrate that Jesus's work here on earth and his atoning work on the cross was not just for the Jewish community or the Israelite community. It's for all nations. It's for Gentiles, because there are Gentiles in his lineage, right? There are Gentiles in his ancestry, and that demonstrates that he came for the Gentiles as well. Now, another perhaps more practical reason, or maybe a more literary reason. Let's call it a literary reason. Notice again, I've pointed this out several times, that all four women have some sort of a sexual scandal associated with their stories. Well, when you come to the story of Mary, that's also a sexual scandal. Now, you and I, we have the benefit of having a behind the scenes look, and we know that there really isn't a sexual scandal with Mary. What she had was conceived by the Holy Spirit. But the people at that time, of course, they didn't know it. They just knew that this young woman who wasn't yet married, hadn't yet consummated her marriage, ends up being pregnant. And so I think Matthew is setting up, this is a literary device also on Matthew's part, where he's setting up with all these sexually scandalous stories, the birth of Jesus that is kind of surrounded by a sexually scandalous event as well. So it flows in the literary narrative that Matthew is laying out here at the beginning of his gospel. But definitely I see the redeeming nature of Jesus Christ as being a major point in including these four women in the descendant or the genealogy of Jesus. And not only that, but very importantly, I'll mention this again, the fact that Gentile women are in the genealogy, I think expresses the fact that Jesus came not just for the Jewish community or the Israelite community, but for the Gentiles as well. So as we look at this, if you're maybe in the Christmas season and you're teaching on this and you're talking about this, don't just gloss over the genealogy of Jesus, both in Matthew and in Luke, and take time to just stop and point this out to your people that you're teaching, because chances are, number one, they probably haven't taken time to read the genealogy, but number two, there's a good chance that some of them don't know what these women represent in the genealogy of Jesus and what their stories are. And I think there's just a lot of beauty and power and impact that come out of these four women's story, especially because they're included in the genealogy of Jesus. So I'll leave you with that. And make of that what you will. Go back and look at the genealogy of Jesus. Go back and look at the story of these four women, and then come to some conclusions of your own. See what they mean to you in the context of the Gospel of Matthew, and as he lays out and begins to lay out the story of the ministry and the life of Jesus Christ. So that's it for now. All right. Hey, consider subscribing. Leave some comments. You agree, you disagree? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to interact with you. God bless.